So this morning, we are beginning a sermon series for this summer, a summer like never before. If you combine COVID-19 and restrictions on social gatherings and nationwide protests for racial justice and a deepening awareness of racism in our culture and institutions, you put all that together and you have a time of tremendous change. Even a turning point from the world we've known to the world that's next. And, time and change are unsettling. So as a result, we may find our prayers taking a different turn. So that's the spur for this sermon series, which is titled, "What the Heck, Lord? God's Presence in Tough Times." And we'll take up that theme in stories coming out of our book of origins, the book of Genesis. Because it turns out Genesis is full of situations where people face really tough times. Sometimes it's just bad luck, and sometimes it's their own fault. But hearing those stories, we might wonder, where is God in this? And we probably find ourselves asking much the same thing about the past few months. So today, we hear part of the story of Abraham and Sarah, to whom God promised descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky. So let me give you the highlights of the 25 years leading up to today's reading. But do not worry, it's 25 years in about 2.5 minutes. Now, when Abraham was 75, God called him and his wife to leave their homeland and to go to a place where God of Abraham a great nation. Now, for that to happen, you kind of need babies, right? Well, 10 years pass and no babies, and Abraham starts to doubt. So God reassures Abraham, don't worry, the promise still holds. But the clock is ticking, and Abraham and Sarah decide to take matters into their own hands. Sarah tells Abraham to have a child with Hagar, an enslaved person in their household, and Hagar gives birth to Ishmael. But this doesn't really solve the problem because Hagar and Sarah can't stand each other. Sarah makes Hagar's enslaved life miserable, and Hagar escapes with the baby, only to be brought back by angels. So not much of a resolution at that point. Then 13 more years pass. Abraham and Sarah are 99 and 90, respectively. And not surprising, they've kind of settled for the life they're living, with Hagar's son Ishmael as the heir. But suddenly God comes and says, "No, Abraham, your descendants will come to Sarah herself." "Yeah, right," Abraham says. And he gives God a mocking laugh. But God is serious. So Abraham listens. Then we come to today's reading, which is not long after Abraham had scoffed at God. God comes to visit again, this time in the form of these 3 travelers we heard about, whom Abraham and Sarah host generously as custom demanded. And the divine emissaries make this promise again, that Sarah will have a son of her own. Now, Sarah overhears this, and like Abraham, she gives a mocking laugh, scoffing at the impossibility of the whole thing. But then the story shifts, and the emissaries are named as the Lord, who says, "Why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too wonderful for the Lord?" Sarah backpedals, but God holds her to her scoffing. "Oh yes, you did laugh." Well, of course she scoffed at such a crazy idea. Of course Abraham had scoffed at it too. They'd heard lots and lots of promises, but nothing in their experience would have made them take the promise seriously this time. They'd been waiting 25 years. Okay, so where's the connection between this story and our present moment? George Floyd's killing and unprecedented protests and change blowing in the wind, as Mother Ann said last week? Well, here is a connection that our experience defines our reality. I mean, we may absorb all kinds of information, and take in all sorts of data. And like Abraham and Sarah, we may receive directions or orders or even divine promises. But at the end of the day, what's real to us is the life that we live. What we trust most is our experience. If you haven't had a baby in the last quarter century, you're probably not painting the nursery this year. So, back to George Floyd and the protests of the past couple of weeks. What must it be like for a person of color to hear the story of white experience in America? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Myself, I can't say. But at the prayer gathering at St. Augustine's Episcopal Church 10 days ago, Congressman Emanuel Cleaver spoke about the talk that his father had with him and that he had with his sons about how careful you must be as a black person if you're stopped by the police. If that's your reality, what must it be like to hear about liberty and justice for all? I could see how a black parent might scoff. Really, you might say. In my experience, all it takes is one wrong move, and my son may not come home that night. And by the same token, what must it be like for a white person to hear the story of black experience in America? Dreams deferred are dreams denied. I can't breathe. Black lives matter, but the systems around me, criminal justice, healthcare, education, those systems say, no, your life doesn't matter. Those words are hard for white people to believe. And our reaction might be to scoff. Really? In my experience, the system works fine. It's individuals who act out. Well, listening to Congressman Cleaver share the story of the talk with his sons made me think of my son, Dan. And specifically, it made me think this. Of all the times that I worried about Dan being out late at night, it never occurred to me to worry about what might happen if he were pulled over. I also remember a time when Dan was a teenager that he wanted to go on a walk to a park about 1.5 miles from our house, walking through several neighborhoods along the way. As he headed out and made his way through other people's neighborhoods, it never occurred to me to worry that people might see him as an intruder. I had the privilege of that possibility never even crossing my mind. How different would things have been if our son had been adopted and looked different than Ann and me? Would I have let him walk by himself through those neighborhoods? Our experience defines our reality, even down to the experience of breathing. Reading coverage of the protests in Kansas City, I came across 2 images that, to me, speak volumes. One is a shot from a protest on the plaza. This woman, you're seeing, she feels she can't breathe. And she's standing in protest because she wants her daughter to know a different reality. Okay, the other shot is an ad that came up on my phone as I was reading. Now together, these images form an icon of the differences in our realities as black people and white people in Kansas City. I think the person in that second photo finds it much easier to breathe than the person with the little girl on her shoulders. I can't tell you how many times I've reminded myself or one of you has reminded me to just breathe. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, as Julian of Norwich said. Well, that's easy for the white woman to pray. The other woman from the protest, I don't know what she'd say about why she feels she can't breathe, but that's her experience. I'd have to make the effort to know her reality in order to find out why. So where is the hope in this fraught moment in our nation's life? I think actually there is a lot of hope in this moment. And I believe hope lies in exploring and participating in realities beyond the reality we know. And I mean that in at least three ways. So first, there is hope in learning about the reality of people whose lives I just don't understand. Not just hearing their words, but hearing their meaning. And maybe the most telling example is the name of the movement itself, Black Lives Matter. I've heard people who look like me say, well, yeah, of course Black Lives Matter. But for those who experience society valuing their lives less, those words mean the need for change across society, change that embodies the practice of dignity. So I believe there is hope when people who look like me try to learn the experience of that mom in the photo. And I believe there is hope when I say it along with her, that Black lives matter. So we're putting together opportunities here at St. Andrews to learn about the reality most of us just don't see, the reality of white privilege. Discussing books or movies and having conversations that include questions we haven't wanted to ask about ourselves and our lives. Then second, I think there is hope in standing with people who need to see that we know their lives matter. Now, we began this a couple of weeks ago, standing on the lawn at St. Aug's on the east side, praying for justice and confessing the sin of racism. And we have another chance to do that this Friday. So churches from across Kansas City will be gathering all along Troost, our city's historical geographic laceration. And there we will mark Juneteenth, the holiday celebrating the end of slavery. This 1 hour witness there on Troost will be silent. Faithful people will come and just stand all up and down Troost, 6 feet apart, in a chain of prayer for racial justice in Kansas City. And to find out how to take part, there's information in the messenger and in the bulletin this week, and we'll send something out about it later this week too. And then third, I think our deepest hope is the reality God longs to see coming from this moment. Because God has given our nation an opportunity for what Lincoln called a new birth of freedom, empowering us to repair and heal the brokenness in which we find ourselves. Now, okay, like Abraham and Sarah, we may be tempted to scoff and say, right. After decades of infertility, the barren woman will give birth. Right. After 25 years of promises, God will finally come through with an heir. Right. After 400 years of slavery and its aftermath, we're going to heal our racial divide. Well, that's the question, isn't it? As the divine visitors ask Abraham and Sarah, is anything too wonderful for the Lord? Now, that scripture leaves us hanging this morning. But a few chapters later, Sarah sees the promise kept, and she laughs differently this time, naming her son, he laughs, which is what Isaac means, and saying, God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. But this time, her laughing isn't scoffing, it's delight. So I think God's question to Abraham and Sarah is God's question to us too. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? As the writer Walter Brueggemann says about Abraham, we too are called to trust that God can cause a break point between the exhausted present and the buoyant future. Now, we struggle mightily with that idea, having become accustomed to our barrenness and accepting hopelessness as normal. And God's powerful promise does sometimes outdistance our ability to trust it. But we worship a God whose whole MO is about hope and healing. God brings light to chaotic darkness. God brings forgiveness to faithlessness. God brings resurrected life to the one the folks in charge nailed to a cross. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? If we answer that question faithfully, then we also must help bring this current act of new creation into being. We have to participate in this new birth of freedom. And more to the point, I have to participate in it. I have to name the reality of my privilege and not assume that what's worked for me works for everybody. I have to ask why people are exhausted from simply trying to breathe. I have to hear and say, Black Lives Matter, not as a slogan, but as a marker of shared grief and indignation for the experience of so many who've heard the opposite message for so long. Can I do that? Can we do that? And God replies, is anything too wonderful for the Lord?